Serious. Urban explorers, what was the creepiest or most mysterious thing you've seen or found during your exploration? My brother had a place close to an abandoned railroad depot. Then there was a box of personal items. The box had homework, personal pictures, and a release form from a teen detention center dated the previous winter. It took seconds to realize the teen was released and shipped to this town and had nowhere to go. He slept for probably a night in this place and then abandoned his only personal possessions. There was an old brick building in the middle of my hometown. It was gutted by fire, but the walls and ceiling remained. It was some kind of grain mill. The place was huge. There was some awesome graffiti art inside. Anyway, the property was all overgrown and wooded. The place had been abandoned for decades. Whenever we went exploring there, it was mostly inside the building. We decided to explore the woods once. They were very dense and difficult to push through. We found a clearing inside. It was almost perfectly circular. There were logs arranged around the circle. A large star made of sticks was in the middle. There were figures of people made of sticks and twigs hanging from nearby branches. I have no idea what the place was, but it was the creepiest thing I've ever seen. Greystone Manor, a psychiatric hospital in New Jersey that is all but gone now. Items used for electroshock therapy, medical equipment, patient records were all still there. Creepy in itself was the entire area had its own zip code, fire station, post office, and housing detached from the main complex. On the top floor, there was a church with a Bible still there with pages open. Offices were still furnished. Dental equipment, including x-ray machines, were still there. It was as if they just left the place one day and left everything there. A new facility opened half a mile down the road. The entire facility was demolished about 2 years ago, as well as all the buildings associated with it, administrative, post office, fire station. What was a huge place is now green grass. The entire area has been converted into a massive park, Central Park of Morris County. Sounds like those Amazon or Google corporate towns that have been proposed if you ask me, which, frankly, might be just as creepy as that place. Dead petrified dog. Was super sad, so I stopped snooping in abandoned places after that. Don't worry, I'm sure wherever that dog is now, he's walking on sunshine. Isn't that right, Seymour? It was a shuttered factory complex in Eastern Europe with a large bunker system underneath the building. There were several rooms literally lined with ripped open first aid kits with the empty morphine needles scattered around. Whoever used them was perfectly content to basically live in a damp, dark, partially burnt-out, musty hole filled with Cold War propaganda and imagery through the duration those needles lasted. A little late to the party, but I've got two good ones which I found really unsettling. The first one was in this old abandoned shack thing, a pile of clothes and things like a toothbrush, hair product, etc., but completely old and dusty and hadn't been touched in a long time. It was clear someone was living there and left immediately without collecting any of their things. On the window were markings like an old prison film counting off the days. I think there were about 100 of them. The second one I can upload a picture of if there's any interest. I found an old abandoned shipping container in a desolate warehouse. A poem scratched on where it was almost impossible to see, not in an obvious place at all. There is no solace for such as we, who search for a city we shall never see. Only the sun, the wind, the rain, a lonely campfire, then the road again. S.H. 1981 to 1984. It was the dates of the initials which made me really sad. I guessed it was written for someone who died at 3 years old, and it was in such an obscure place it seemed to have been written with the intention of never being read. Also, scratching on the same shipping container I found, I assume by somebody else, "My life is worthless. Find me. August 15, 2012. This was in 2013 that I found it. It was very unsettling. When I'm home, I'll upload pictures if anyone comments wanting to see them. That is all pretty sad, but that poem was honestly kind of beautiful. Most, if not all, other abandoned places I have been empty, but one house still had silverware and family photos. Not so much urban, but my dad and uncles used to take me along on hunting trips quite a bit to our regular stomping grounds in northern central Pennsylvania. I was 16 and this occurrence really stuck with me. My oldest uncle was a park ranger for the surrounding area, so we had a pretty good handle on the areas we traversed and we stuck to the places we knew. We'd split up and my dad and I would push deer through and my uncles would shoot anything we pushed out. After about an hour solo, my pops and I came across a cemetery in the middle of nowhere. It was spookily quiet. No animal sounds, just snow falling. All these crumbling small stone structures, some were pre-Civil War, some were Civil War soldiers. Hard to make out quite a bit of them, but it was just very out there. It'd be an hour hike from any known road and just spookily untouched. No animal tracks, no nothing. We kind of booked it out of there when my dad tried to radio over to my uncle and nothing was going through. We ended up screaming, hooting, and whistling for him and my other uncle for a good 10 minutes before we caught up. No idea what twilight zone we ended up at, but I remember my dad trying to mark it on the map via the route we took for my uncle so he could at least turn it in for preservation. I just wanted the hell out of the woods. There's an old abandoned warehouse not too far from where one of my friends live. I was visiting, and we like to go places you're not supposed to go. One night, a group of people decided to skin another person alive because they didn't like him inside this building. You can still see splatters of blood on the walls. Guess they didn't feel the need to clean it up too well since it is boarded up and whatnot. The entire place feels eerie and makes you angry, like ridiculously angry for no apparent reason. Apparently, there's a ton of asbestos and other bad-for-you materials in there. If I find a picture on my laptop, I will post it. I'll play the role of villain in this story. A buddy and I used to hang out in this abandoned mansion in our city, cleaning and fixing whatever fixtures were left behind. We put a lot of what into that place to make it nice. But one day, a group of teenagers smashed through a glass door to come in and smoke pot. The mansion was usually pitch black in most of the rooms, but I knew the place well enough to navigate without hurting myself. These kids did not. While they're crashing and banging about in my project, I would follow very quietly and slide things across the floor to make noise. Eventually, these kids started getting even more brazen, breaking lamps and punching holes in the wall, and one gets on the phone with a friend to set up a party. So, my buddy crawls into a cabinet and starts scratching the side wall loudly, and I zoom through the house making vague whispering noises. These poor explorers were getting more and more anxious until they reached the main room, at which point my friend and I let out piercing screams and chased them from the place. At least one of those people now fully believes in ghosts. Maybe all hauntings are just people doing projects who are losing their patience. A friend and I were exploring a newly abandoned building in the middle of the night, but that's not where the creepiness happened unless you count a giant pentagram spray painted on the floor. It was a college town, so we didn't think much of it. Before we really got much exploring done, we heard a dog barking nearby, so we went to see if we could find it. We did. Well, sort of. The dog was wearing a collar, so we were trying to get close enough to read the owner's information. It would let us get a couple of feet away before taking off again at lightning speed. Not that abnormal, but it got weirder. At one point we had it cornered at the bottom of a set of stairs into what was essentially a walled pit behind one of the dormitories. We watched it go down the stairs. My friend followed the dog down the stairs while I stood at the top of the brick wall to watch the dog as it ran behind one of the dumpsters. When my friend reached the area where the dumpsters were, the dog wasn't there. The door to the building was locked. I had not seen it run back up the steps and had been keeping an eye on the whole area, so it's doubtful I would have missed it. Then we heard the dog howling nearby, but not from where we thought it would be. Somewhat strange, but this still could be possible, right? So we followed the howling, because at this point it was getting a bit eerie. We didn't see the dog again for a while, but kept hearing it howling nearby. It was definitely moving. We followed it up a steep hill, which led off campus into a wooded area. At this point, we'd been chasing this dog for several hours as the sun was about to come up. We were still determined, especially after a whole night of chasing this mysterious dog. And this is where it got even weirder. We reached a steep embankment as we drew closer to the howling, whose tone had become almost mournful. We wondered if the dog was sick or hurt, so we climbed up to the top. What we found up there was not what we'd expected. There was no dog. Instead, there was a very old cabin which had almost completely collapsed with all the former owner's possessions still inside. There were no other cabins around, but that in itself wasn't terribly strange so much as it was interesting. And then, beside the cabin, we discovered what remained of an old doghouse, its pen knocked over and covered by pine needles. We never found the dog, and its howling stopped as soon as we reached the abandoned structure. Okay, but did you stop to consider that the dog was just really crafty and was trying to lead you away from the building that it was working on a project in? I'm just saying, all hauntings are just people working on projects. I was exploring a large abandoned hospital complex and came across a house on the property. I assume it once belonged to the head of the hospital and his family, as the complex was incredibly isolated and a self-sustaining place. We climbed in through a downstairs window, and the house is in fairly decent shape and mostly empty, all apart from an old baby's cradle. This thing was old. It looked Victorian, like it had been lifted off an old-fashioned pram or stroller. Very gothic looking, if I'm honest, and definitely not the kind of thing you would see anymore. We walked past and made some standard "that's creepy" comments and quickly checked out the rest of the house. There wasn't much. We have to go back through the baby cradle room to get out the window, and as we walk in, I stop dead in my tracks. My friend asks what's wrong and then sees for himself. The cradle has moved several feet and is rocking. There's no breeze, and even if there was, that thing is heavy enough to have left light scratches on the wooden floor. We heard and saw no one else in the area. Still cannot explain it. I found a bloody shirt, pants, shoes, and underwear in an old busted-down house in the woods. When I say bloody, I mean pretty sure somebody was murdered bloody. Might be making something out of nothing, but nonetheless, creepy. Spring of 2008, I lived in Bolingbrook, Illinois at the time. A friend and I were exploring an abandoned drive-in theater nearby. In the concessions building, it's complete darkness. I rounded the corner into a restroom, and my flashlight illuminated a 55-gallon blue barrel smack in the middle of the floor. I near crapped myself. It was full of clear rainwater from the leaky roof and nothing more. Some context. When my husband and I were traveling in Moldova, I read about an abandoned Soviet military base in the woods. It was under construction when the Soviet Union fell, and so it had just been left as it was. Another group had visited it before us and taken some pretty good pictures as well, and I had to see it for myself. This base is in the middle of nowhere. I could tell from Google's satellite view that there was a road in, but when we got there, it turned out to be extremely difficult to travel this road by car. It was basically 3 square concrete blocks across, but someone had removed the middle of the 3 all the way down the road, so you'd have to balance your wheels on the other 2. There was also quite a few ruts and puddles in the road, and since we had a rental car that we didn't want to damage, we just parked near the entrance to this road and walked the 1.5 kilometers or so to the base. As we headed down this road, there was a group of 4 to 5 dogs standing in our way. We yelled to scare them off. One dog seemed curious rather than threatening and ended up following us the rest of the time we were at the base, which meant several kilometers of walking. It didn't seem very healthy, and I wished we could take it home with us, but that was obviously impossible. Sadly, I didn't even have any food to offer it. As far as I'd seen, there were 3 major structures left on the base. One, just a skeleton of a building that had never been built, was easy enough to visit, but not exceptionally interesting. Then there was the administrative building, which was much more complete, but when we got near this, a very large number of dogs started barking. There appeared to be at least 20 dogs hanging out around this building, and they didn't sound very friendly at all. We abandoned this attempt and headed in the other direction toward the 3rd building, which was basically underground and quite unique in appearance. Between us and the 3rd building was a pile of rubble which we began to clamber over when my husband, who was taller than me, stopped and said, "There's someone living back there." We decided not to get involved with whoever this person was and whatever they were doing, but my husband said there was kind of a wooden shack with a guy hanging around. As we walked back toward the car, still quite a way away from it, a white van with 2 guys inside came down the concrete path. I suppose they traveled it often since they didn't have any trouble staying on the concrete blocks on each side and had obviously dealt with the ruts. I was quite anxious about these guys and what they might be up to at this abandoned base in the middle of nowhere, but they didn't stop or give us any trouble. All of this was probably fairly harmless, but since I hadn't really expected to see any life at all in this abandoned Soviet base in the middle of nowhere, it felt very creepy. I'm not gonna lie, this story feels like one big creepy tease. I feel like we kept just getting outside hints at the true creepiness within, all for basically no payoff. There was an old factory about a mile from my house growing up. I explored it when I was about 13. Must have been abandoned for many years because the 2nd floor had fallen down on the 1st floor. Well, it was winter and I was walking around the 3rd floor and I found 2 really big coolers, both of them filled to the top of rubber gloves. But these rubber gloves were actually filled with ice, so they looked like there were hands in them. They must have been filled in summer and stayed there till winter. No clue as to what or why. No water or ice in the cooler, just the full tied-off rubber gloves. Must have been at least 100 of them. Building was torn down less than a year later. I'm not an urban explorer or anything, but when I was around 12 or 13, I broke into a very small abandoned house near my uncle's cottage. The owner of that house was a man who had died some 20 to 25 years ago. The whole place was completely untouched, so I'm pretty sure the last persons to be there before me were the EMTs who locked up after they took away the body. The bed where the guy died probably was unmade and messy. The pillow and the blankets were half-eaten by moths. Same with the clothes hanging in the closet. Floor was covered in rat crap. There were dirty dishes in the sink, which were stained yellow. On the bathroom table, there was an open book and some others stacked next to it. In the drawers, there was some random stuff, matchboxes, shaving kit, etc. Other than that, it seemed the guy died completely broke since there was nothing else in the house. No photos or documents, no TV or radio, no extra furniture or any other items. Doors and windows were locked, so no one else had been there. The man who died had no relatives, according to my uncle, and was only 45 to 50 years old. Honestly, that just sounds more sad than creepy. A man who had died with no one to pass his things on to, and frankly, not much to pass on. Large abandoned federal prison. It was a sanctioned tour, so not sure if that counts as urban exploration, but it was dark and creepy, and there were physical safety issues. We went through the psych ward and the infirmary as the last stops of the tour when we were allowed to just wander freely. My group of 4 went back to the psych ward. This time there was a huge raven dead in the middle of the floor of the first room on the psych ward. Its head was at a crazy angle and it was lying in a puddle of blood that was still wet. All windows were closed and intact. We left and re-entered through the only door that led to the rest of the building. No one saw or heard anything like a bird, and it was in the middle of the night, so it wouldn't have just been flying around. Made me think there were probably creepy squatters who weren't happy about the overnight tours, which had just started the week before, so it really gave me the creeps. I once came across a small single-story office building with one room burned down, and only that room. Other rooms had various office supplies. It was weird enough that the only room that had file cabinets was the only one burned. As I went deeper into the building from the front entrance, there was an emptied room with a single chair in the middle of it with an empty gas can next to it. What happened, why, and how will never be answered, and that bothers me. Broke into a huge abandoned building in London, and after much prevention we managed to get the roof, and there was a room filled with dead birds. There must have been at least 30 of them there. Some were just skeletons. Made my nipples hard when I saw it. It was frightening at first. I'm sorry, it did what to you now? That's not a fear reaction I'm familiar with. Frankly, that was the creepiest part of your whole story. Friend and I hopped some gates to get into an abandoned power plant so that he could take photos for fun. Accidentally ran into a meth lab and got chased out by 6 Rottweilers and a crazy lady. That was an interesting day. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.